always held true. Think of Napoleon marching on Russia 100 years ago and the disaster it ended in for him. Russia had thousands upon thousands of miles of land, and if the enemy made some gains or even took a whole province, so what? It would simply be retaken when the enemy stretched itself too thin and became exhausted. And how does an enemy counter this when the enemy can't think like that? None of the other armies had that luxury. It was immoral for the Germans to cede any of East Prussia to the Russians. It was humiliating for the Austrians that Russia now held Austrian ground and cities, and it was absolutely unthinkable for the Belgians and the French to give up an inch of their land to the Germans in the West, where the war for a decisive victory was now a war for roads, villages, and hills. The race to the sea had been going on for weeks as the Germans tried to outflank the British, French, and Belgians, and vice versa. The trench lines grew ever longer as neither side was able to gain an advantage, and both sides were forced to dig in. Battles that would rage for weeks began in places like La Bassée, Armentières, and Messines as the lines grew further and further north. On the 11th, the Germans began bombarding Lille, which surrendered on the 13th and would remain in German hands for the next 4 years. This part of France and Belgium, called Flanders, was still mostly untouched by the war, and when, on October 14th, some British forces entered the town of Ypres, it seemed like a nice quiet little country town. They promptly began calling it Wipers. The next day, they marched east a few miles and made preparations to make a quick advance on the Germans as soon as the rest of the British Expeditionary Force turned up. No one realized yet that this quaint little patch of Belgian countryside would become the gravesite for over 200,000 British soldiers during the next 4 years. British soldiers were going to a watery grave this week as well, as the German submarine U-9, already infamous for dispatching 3 British cruisers in 1 hour, torpedoed the Hawk in the North Sea. 525 British sailors drowned, only 21 were saved. However, as the war in the seas grew and developed, the British gained a lucky advantage. Russia sent them a German Navy signal book it had captured when the German signalman about to destroy it was killed by an artillery shell. Because of this, British cryptographers in future had a leg up decoding wireless messages and finding their adversaries at sea. So there we are at the end of the week, with the British arriving at a nice quiet town called Ypres at the northern end of the miles and miles of trenches. The Austrians sinking into despair as their maneuvers once again proved disastrous. The Germans realizing that Russia was nowhere near as incompetent as they'd thought, and the Russians bringing more and more and ever more men to bear down on the Germans along the Vistula River. Germany and Austria knew, of course, that Russia had the population advantage, but they'd gone to war confident that their advantages in tactics and equipment would more than make up for this. And for the Germans, at least so far, it had. But nobody quite realized the depth of the Russian reinforcements. And as the enemy army's initial forces were depleted, that depth, as well as the use of the endless open space, had finally made the Russian army a real force to be reckoned with. And over the next 2 months, hundreds of thousands of men would die on the enormous battlefields of the Eastern Front. If you'd like to see how the trench warfare developed in this war, check out these episodes about the battles on the banks of the Iron River, and click subscribe to never miss an episode for the next 4 years. Europe had been at war for less than 3 months, but already hundreds of thousands of young men had died horribly. In the interests of morale and patriotism, the media in each warring nation had portrayed its side as good and the enemy as evil, and what we begin to see is that there was a gap created between what people believed about the war at home and what was actually happening on the front. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. At the beginning of the week, the Russians were crossing the Vistula to try and stop the Germans, who were intent on capturing Warsaw. The Austrians had broken out of the siege at Przemysl, but were badly beaten by the Russians on the River Seine, and the British had just arrived at a sleepy little Belgian town called Ypres. German Army Chief of Staff Falkenhayn had assembled a new army under the Duke of Württemberg to take over the right flank of the German forces in Flanders, which is this part of Belgium and northern France. A lot of the new units were reservists, though, middle-aged men past campaigning, or young recruits that hadn't really been trained, and in their first few days of battle, they would make catastrophic mistakes. Now, the only gap on the Western Front through which either side might possibly make some sort of decisive maneuver was a narrow corridor right here. And that's where the action was happening. On Sunday, October 18th, the British headed eastward from Ypres towards Menin, nearly 20 kilometers away and in German hands. And there were a few skirmishes, but nothing major. The next day, as the advance progressed, British pilots reported huge columns of advancing Germans who would be upon them in hours, so the British withdrew to a low ridge overlooking Ypres. This area would be known as the Ypres salient. Now, a salient in battle is a projection of the line like a bulge, which means that the enemy can attack it on three sides. The Ypres salient would be the scene over the next 4 years of some of the bloodiest and harshest battles in all of human history. On the 20th, the Germans attacked along the whole front, 24 divisions against 19, but the main contest this day was at Ypres, where 14 German divisions attacked 7 British, though most of the German forces were Württemberg's reservists. The British were outnumbered in men and artillery, but they were equal to the enemy in machine guns, and they managed to hold their line because of their superiority in rapid rifle fire. Now here we find, as we did at the Battle of the Mons in August, the stories of the Mad Minute. A mad minute was, according to the British soldiers of the Great War, the art of hitting 15 targets in 1 minute with a bolt-action rifle, which the British professionals were trained to. And legend has it that at both Mons and the first action at Ypres, German soldiers thought they were facing machine gun fire when in fact it was only intense rifle fire. The German forces made the novice's mistake of advancing in large masses and presented huge targets to the British rifles, suffering terrible casualties. And for the next 3 days, they continued banging their heads against the British lines, attacking by both day and night on a widening front. Looking at it objectively after the fact, these attacks were exercises in futility along the lines of the French attacks we saw at the Battle of the Frontiers in August, with devastating losses for the Germans, and the salient held. Those Germans were volunteers, doing their part for the fatherland, and they had heard for 3 months that the British troops were a joke and would be easily overcome, so they rushed off to die. On the British side, we also see the public failing to understand what was actually happening. British General Smith-Dorrien wrote, quote, "I was struck by the fact that people in England didn't in the least realize the strenuous nature of the fighting at the front, or that we were a long, thin line, without reserves, which might be broken through at any time. Their minds seemed set on what appeared to me a ridiculous fear of an invasion of England," end quote. There was no danger of that at the moment, for it was true stalemate in Belgium and would be for the next 4 years. Further north along the line, the remnants of the Belgian army, now down to around 60,000 men, were holding the coast at Newport, at the mouth of the Isère River. The Isère is a narrow river, but it has embankments, and it was a major military obstacle for the Germans. And the Belgians fought valiantly, earning the praise of even their enemy, who were unable to break through. There were, however, breakthroughs on the Eastern Front, where the war had become a war of perpetual motion for the time being. The Russians had been sending troops across their bridgehead on the Vistula River for over a week now, fighting off the Germans who had been trying to take Warsaw. Early on, the Germans had the advantage, but Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff had completely underestimated the size of the enemy, as Russian reinforcements never stopped coming in, being cleverly and secretly well deployed by the Russians. From October 18th to 23rd, the Russian army, after weeks of preparations, began its own attack, even threatening to surround the Germans, who began to retreat on the 20th, realizing that with the mud and the sheer number of opponents, they would not be able to take Warsaw. Further south, the Austrian Chief of Staff Conrad tried again to take on the Russians with his army, this time at Ivangorod. This was not as prudent as the German retreat. On the 22nd, the Austrians attacked, and 4 days later, they were forced to retreat, with 40,000 Austrian casualties. Once again, the Russians would surround Przemysl fortress, garrisoned by 150,000 men, and it would once again be an Austrian island in an ocean of Russian territory. And since I mentioned oceans, we should turn our attention to the Yellow Sea, where the Japanese had the German port of Tsingtao under total blockade. This week, the German torpedo boat S-90 slipped out of the harbor and sank the Japanese cruiser Takachiho with a single torpedo. 271 sailors were drowned. The S-90 was, however, unable to run the blockade and returned to Tsingtao afterwards, and was scuttled by the Germans when she ran low on fuel. There was one very important